The first tumbleweed rolled into Caleb Turner's yard by accident. The second arrived because he chased it. By the 100th, the entire valley was laughing. "Look," one rancher shouted from horseback. "The poor fool's building himself a nest." Caleb grinned and kept working. He had learned long ago that people laughed at ideas they didn't understand, especially when those ideas looked strange. 3 months earlier, Caleb had been forced from the homestead his father built. The land wasn't lost through gambling or poor decisions. It disappeared beneath paperwork. A railroad survey changed county boundaries. A legal dispute followed. By the time lawyers finished arguing, Caleb no longer owned the property. The court ruled against him. He packed what little remained: an old wagon, a mule, basic tools, 2 blankets, and enough flour to last a few weeks. Everything else stayed behind. At 36 years old, Caleb found himself homeless just as autumn winds swept across the prairie. Most settlers advised him to leave. Go farther west. Find work in another town. Start over. Caleb thanked them politely, then did exactly the opposite. He stayed. The prairie had been home his entire life. He knew every creek, every hill, every change in the wind. If the land had supported him once, perhaps it could again. He simply needed to look at it differently. Several weeks later, while repairing a fence for a rancher, Caleb noticed enormous tumbleweeds collecting against a line of cottonwood trees. Hundreds of them. Dry, lightweight, interlocked so tightly the wind couldn't separate them. Curious, he climbed onto the pile. The center surprised him. Despite cool evening temperatures, the inside felt noticeably warmer than the open prairie. The tightly woven stems trapped still air. Nature had built its own insulation. Caleb sat there quietly, thinking. The next day he returned, this time carrying a notebook. He studied how the tumbleweeds tangled together, how the rounded shape resisted the wind, how rain rolled across the outer surface instead of soaking deeply inside. An idea slowly formed. What if a shelter worked the same way? Not built from expensive logs, built from what everyone else ignored. Construction began the following week. He chose a gentle rise overlooking the valley. The location drained well after rain and received sunlight throughout the day. First, Caleb drove thick willow pools into the ground in a wide circle. He bent them inward until they formed a dome-shaped frame. Then came the tumbleweeds. Hundreds of them. He wove each one carefully between the pools, layer after layer. The walls grew thicker every day. Prairie grass filled smaller gaps. Bundles of cattails strengthened weak spots. Finally, he covered the outer surface with tightly woven reed mats coated in clay and mud. When everything dried, the shelter resembled a giant rounded haystack. Only the doorway revealed it wasn't. The first visitors arrived before he even finished. Tom Willis climbed off his horse and stared. "What in heaven's name is that?" "My house." Tom blinked. "No." "Yes. You built it from weeds." "Tumbleweeds." "Same thing." Caleb smiled. They were free. Tom burst into laughter. Soon 2 more ranchers joined him. One circled the structure. Another poked the wall. "It'll blow away the first windy day." Caleb shook his head. The wind shaped the design. That only produced more laughter. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the settlement knew about the tumbleweed house. Children nicknamed it the Prairie Igloo. Adults preferred another name, the Weed Nest. One old rancher declared, "Might as well sleep inside a bird's nest." Caleb thanked him. Birds stay pretty warm. The joke spread faster than the truth. Still, Caleb continued working. Inside, the shelter looked surprisingly comfortable. The circular shape created one open room. A small stone fireplace occupied the center. Sleeping platforms lined the walls. Above, a tiny smoke vent sat beneath a weather cap that prevented rain from entering. The thick tumbleweed walls measured nearly 3 feet across. Most of that thickness contained trapped air. Exactly what Caleb wanted. As autumn turned colder, he noticed something remarkable. The shelter stayed comfortable long after sunset. Not because of the fireplace, because the thick walls slowed heat loss. Even without burning much wood, the inside changed temperature gradually. Curious, Caleb performed a simple test. He lit a small fire before bed, allowed it to burn out completely. When he woke before sunrise, the shelter remained far warmer than the outside air. The insulation had done its job. A few days later, Tom returned. "Mind if I look inside?" Caleb stepped aside. Tom entered cautiously. He expected loose weeds scattered everywhere. Instead, he found clean woven walls, A sturdy timber floor, warm lantern light, surprisingly little draft. He ran his hand across the inside wall. It doesn't feel cold. Caleb nodded. The air stays inside the walls. Tom looked confused. The weeds do that. The trapped air does. Tom frowned thoughtfully. I still think it'll freeze. We'll find out. Early December brought the first real cold wave. Temperatures dropped below anything the valley had experienced the previous winter. Every cabin filled with smoke. Axes echoed through nearby forests as settlers cut additional firewood. Caleb quietly kept notes. Each evening he measured indoor and outdoor temperatures, recorded how much wood he burned, compared changes every morning. The results amazed even him. The tumbleweed walls performed better than expected. With only a tiny fire each evening, the shelter remained comfortable through the night. On sunny afternoons, the rounded dome absorbed warmth. The insulation trapped it until morning. He needed far less firewood than neighboring cabins. Yet nobody believed him. Impossible, Tom insisted. Weeds can't beat logs. Caleb simply smiled. Maybe not. Then came the weather report. A government courier arrived carrying alarming news from the Northern Territories. An Arctic air mass had crossed Canada. Entire settlements reported record temperatures. Several mountain passes already stood closed. The system continued moving south, straight toward the prairie. The courier folded his map carefully. If this storm behaves like the last reports suggest. The room fell silent. You'll remember it for the rest of your lives. That evening, Caleb hauled every remaining bundle of tumbleweeds against the outside walls, adding one final insulating layer. He reinforced the entrance, covered the roof with another coating of clay, filled every water barrel, stacked enough firewood for weeks. As darkness settled across the prairie, the wind began to rise. By midnight, snow swept sideways across the open land, and before dawn, the world outside disappeared into white. By sunrise on the second day, Caleb could no longer see the prairie. Snow had swallowed everything. The doorway opened onto a white wall. Wind roared across the plains like a freight train, yet inside the tumbleweed dome the noise sounded distant, softened by nearly 3 feet of woven stems and packed reeds. Caleb added only 2 small logs to the stove, not because he lacked firewood, because he didn't need more. The shelter held yesterday's warmth. Every hour he checked the thermometer hanging near the entrance. Outside, the temperature continued falling. Inside, it barely changed. He carefully wrote each measurement into his notebook. The numbers amazed even him. Late that afternoon came a frantic pounding. At first, Caleb thought it was another gust of wind. Then he heard shouting. He forced the door open against a drift taller than his shoulders. Tom Willis stumbled inside, carrying his youngest daughter, Anna. His wife, Rebecca, followed close behind. All 3 were covered in snow. Our chimney collapsed, Tom gasped. The whole cabin filled with smoke. Caleb quickly shut the heavy door. Within moments, the silence returned. Anna slowly looked around. This place is warm. Tom stared toward the small stove. That's all you've got burning? Caleb nodded. Only enough to cook. Tom frowned. No. He walked around the circular room, placed both hands against the woven wall. Expected cold. Instead, he felt only a gentle chill. The thick tumbleweed layers trapped almost every draft. You've barely used any wood. Caleb pointed toward a neat stack beside the doorway. I've burned less than half. Tom looked down. His boots were drying already. His fingers no longer hurt. The warmth didn't blast from the stove. It simply surrounded them. Steady, even, comfortable. For the next 4 days, the Willis family stayed inside the dome. Life settled into a routine. Rebecca baked bread over the small stove. Anna gathered melted snow for washing. Tom couldn't stop studying the walls. Eventually, he asked the question that had bothered him since arriving. What made you think tumbleweeds could do this? Caleb smiled. I didn't. Tom looked confused. I thought trapped air could. He picked up one dried tumbleweed from a pile near the entrance. Look closely. Tom examined it. Hundreds of tiny stems intertwined, creating thousands of little air pockets. The weed isn't doing the insulating. Caleb smiled. The air hiding inside it is. Tom slowly nodded. So that's why the walls are so thick. Exactly. The storm continued for another 5 days. 9 days in total. By then, many settlers had nearly exhausted their firewood. Several cabins suffered collapsed roofs. Others lost doors to the relentless wind. The rounded dome barely noticed. Snow piled harmlessly around it. The curved roof encouraged wind to flow over the shelter instead of striking it directly. Without sharp corners, the storm found little to grab. When the blizzard finally ended, Caleb climbed through a small roof hatch he had built for emergencies. He pulled himself onto the dome. The view stunned everyone. The shelter appeared as nothing more than a rounded snow-covered hill rising gently above the prairie. Almost invisible, the valley below looked devastated. Several cabins had partially collapsed. Barn roofs disappeared beneath enormous drifts. Fences no longer existed. Tom stood beside Caleb in silence. Finally he laughed. They called this a bird's nest. Caleb grinned. Birds know a thing or two. The men spent the next several days helping neighbors dig out homes. Everywhere they went, people asked the same question. How did that weed house survive? Tom answered before Caleb could. Because it wasn't really built from weeds. People looked puzzled. It was built from trapped air. Most didn't understand. So Caleb invited anyone curious to visit. Soon groups of settlers climbed the hill. They inspected every part of the dome. The willow framework, the woven tumbleweeds, the thick reed mats, the clay outer coating. One carpenter circled the shelter twice. Finally he admitted, I laughed at this. So did everyone. I won't again. Spring arrived slowly. The prairie turned green once more. Caleb decided to expand the shelter. While digging a shallow drainage trench around the foundation, his shovel struck something hard. Wood. He cleared away more dirt. A small cedar chest appeared beneath the soil. The weathered lid creaked as he opened it. Inside rested several journals wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The first page carried a name. Silas McCrae, a buffalo hunter who had crossed the prairie nearly 40 years earlier. That evening Caleb sat beneath a lantern reading. Silas described brutal prairie winters, blinding winds, frozen wagons, entire camps destroyed. Then one passage caught Caleb's attention. The prairie dogs survive because they borrow the earth. Several pages later came another. The tribes weave grass thicker than blankets. The wind cannot steal warmth trapped inside dead plants. Caleb smiled. Silas had learned from observing both nature and the native people who understood the plains far better than newcomers. The final journal entry read, Settlers keep building against the prairie. The prairie always wins. Better to build with it. Caleb closed the journal gently. He finally understood why his shelter had worked so well. He hadn't invented anything. He had simply rediscovered old wisdom hidden in plain sight. Years passed. Travelers crossing the prairie often stopped to see the famous Tumbleweed Dome. Many expected a crude shack. Instead, they found a surprisingly comfortable home. Cool during summer, warm during winter, built almost entirely from materials everyone else ignored. Some copied the design exactly. Others adapted the ideas. Round barns appeared. Thicker insulated walls became common. Farmers stopped burning tumbleweeds each autumn. Instead, they gathered them. One snowy evening many years later, Caleb stood outside watching the sunset glow across the white prairie. Children played near several dome-shaped shelters scattered across neighboring farms. What had once been the valley's biggest joke had quietly become one of its smartest traditions. People often claimed his tumbleweed house survived because it cost nothing. Caleb knew better. Its true value wasn't measured in dollars. It came from seeing usefulness where everyone else saw weeds. The settlers had laughed when he built a house from tumbleweeds.